Gerald Hannon put it best in our 10th anniversary issue when he talked about in 1972 welcoming the Prime Minister to Toronto on behalf of its homosexual citizens, and being asked what exactly it was he did, and explaining that he worked for the Body Politic. He said in reflection that he was quite certain the Prime Minister didn't know what the Body Politic was, and probably never thought he'd have another occasion to, until, lo and behold, less than 10 years later, our name was being bounced around the floor of the House of Commons as people were demanding tighter obscenity legislation. I don't think any of us in 1972 would have predicted that outcome. I think many of us would have been quite satisfied with that respectable little network that we'd had built up by 1977.
1972, I guess, 72 or early 73. Yeah, probably early 73. And it was interesting because I had the same kinds of misconceptions about pedophilia that most people have, and I sort of thought it through and talked to some people. I thought, oh, this is interesting. I'll write a little essay type number on it, and that will deal with the problem of pedophilia for good, and that'll be nice because nobody will have all these misconceptions anymore. They'll just read the Body Politic, and that'll be that. And the piece I wrote back then did cause a kind of fuss. I mean, it got picked up by the papers and editorialized about, and there were no criminal charges that time. We were really, I think, too insubstantial a publication and too new, and people felt very confident that homosexuals were a teeny minority and wouldn't cause anybody any problems, and so you could just raise a little shit in the papers, and that was that. But I was really shocked. I was really shocked at that time, and really kind of upset and almost personally hurt because somebody had misunderstood my essay, is what it came down to almost. And I mean, that was an important thing to happen in a way for me, because it was the beginning of my politicization, I think, as a writer.
But what happened, you see, because Gayap in itself means collective, once the whole structure was set up, you find Gayap was no longer just the same 3 or 4 brothers who was jamming, but Gayap was everyone now who wanted to share in that expression. So at the time when I got involved, and my interest was in playing the drums, I immediately became part of Gayap. And there are a number of other people who at different stages were also part of Gayap, and as their own knowledge and experience increase, they move on to bigger things. Most of the members of Truths and Rights actually were at one time members of Gayap, and as I say, as they develop, the whole cultural expression started to expand more. So that's how Truths and Rights partly came into being too, through the whole Emican experience.
What does this have to do with poetry?
Yeah,
I wrote about all that stuff.
Yeah, you were saying that you wrote a lot. That was a really prolific period when you were working in the government as a clerk. Do you have any of that stuff with you?
Oh, sure. I wrote, short poems, long poems. I don't have anything. I have one poem, which was, it's called, I used to work at the Employee Benefits Branch of the Ministry of Government Services, and I wrote a poem called Death is Temporary, and it goes, pictures on desks indicate there is life after work. I wrote, I had a lot, I don't know why I wrote a lot at work, because I had a pen in my hand, and a lot of crap to go through, and I started writing, they give you a lot of notepads, They do. Actually, that's on ration too. So.
Open up your mind, open up your mind, open up your mind. Open up your mind, open up your mind, open up your mind. Open up your mind, open up your mind, open up your eyes, open up your eyes, open up your mind, open up your mind. Open up your mind, open up your mind. Anywhere we go, it's the same thing. You reach out so many poor. Anywhere we go, it's the same thing. The rich ripping off the poor. They're squeezing us to death, yeah. Squeezing us to death, yeah. Squeezing us to death with their prices. Their hands around my neck, yeah. Strangling me to death, yeah. Won't let me catch my breath, I can't breathe. some milk. Open up your eyes, open up your eyes, open up your eyes, open up your eyes, open up your mind, open up your mind, open up your mind, open up your mind. Look at the daily paper, South Future and South Africa. He spoke of its value to the West, how good the returns when you invest. Human liberty is ignored, human liberty is ignored, while the profits soar, while the profits soar. Hey, open up your eyes, open up your eyes, open up your eyes, open up your eyes, open up your mind, open up your mind, open up your mind, open up your mind. No conscience, no conscience, no conscience at all. 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 Open up your eyes, open up your eyes, open up your eyes, open up your eyes, open up your mind, open up your mind, open up your mind, open up your mind. Open up your eyes, open up your eyes. Open up your eyes, open up your eyes, open up your eyes. Open up your mind, open up your mind, open up your mind. Open up your mind, open up your mind, open up your mind.
In about 1972, a strategy was put together of bringing together organizations in the province of Ontario to try to have human rights legislation amended to include gay rights. And there were at that time about a half a dozen organizations in the province, maybe twice that many even. And they spent 5 years working very hard on the project and mainly using it as an excuse to bring politically interested gay people together and to get a little airtime on the media and just in general create a profile for themselves and do some educational work. The legal rights part of it was sort of the excuse and more or less acknowledged as that by a lot of us, I think. After about 5 years, in 1977, a really respectable little network had grown up across the province and had intervened in a number of political events in the community, in particular debates about what the Human Rights Code should be like for the future, and briefs were presented all over the province, and the government's own commission finally recommended to the government that they amend the code to include sexual orientation, and many of us were feeling like we'd come a long way, and that this was a kind of sign of how successful we'd been at turning this excuse into something useful. At that very time, the Quebec government had amended the Quebec Charter to include sexual orientation. The Canadian government, or rather Gayap, had done a poll showing that the Canadian population, 52% of it supported the same amendment to the Federal Human Rights Act, and only 30% were opposed. And so things were looking good. Looming on the horizon, however, was Anita Bryant. That was the summer that she was able to overturn the gay rights ordinance in Dade County, Florida. And a week after the government commission recommended sexual orientation in the Human Rights Code, there was a murder of a young child above a body rub parlor on the main street, Yonge Street. And the media really sensationalized it. And in fact, the murderers were apprehended when the one of them who had any connection at all to the gay community went to a gay leader and was sent to a lawyer and turned himself into the police. And not only did the gay community not get credit for having apprehended these criminals, they were in fact pinned with the crime collectively. And the Body Politic had, as the gay movement in general, had explored the issue of childhood sexuality and had in fact published 2 articles in a series by Gerald Hannon on exactly that subject when this murder occurred. We held off publishing the 3rd issue, which was the article Men Loving Boys Loving Men, that we were finally raided and charged for until several months after the murder itself, having debated and thought very seriously about what publishing that article would mean. We finally realized that the reason we had initiated the series in the first place was because this item, as it were, had been put on the agenda by Anita Bryant and her ilk, including their Canadian counterparts. And we had basically been forced to. We had a choice, and that choice was to either allow people like Anita Bryant to get away with casting the image of a gay person as child molester into the political fray and using it to block development of gay rights in the gay community, or we could confront that image. And by ignoring her and that stereotype and that accusation, we would have basically been sacrificing those individuals within our own community, gay people who were involved in sexual relationships, consensual sexual relationships across gender lines, specifically quite young people and people older than themselves. And that was not something that gay liberation in general or the Body Politic in particular was prepared to do. We come together as a community and came together as a political movement on the basis of some understanding of how our sexuality is oppressed. Much of that oppression takes place within the context of the family, socialization, and through our childhoods. And having been deprived of our right to determine our own sexuality through a lot of that experience, none of us were prepared to be complicit in any way in depriving anyone else, gay or otherwise, of those rights. It's a difficult thing to defend to a lot of people. It hits right at an enormous emotional taboo, and Anita Bryant et al. Know that full well and exploit it for all it's worth. And yet every time the gay movement in this country has come together formally, nationally, to debate the issue, we've finally decided that the only principled stand we can take is for the abolition of age of consent laws. And that hasn't made it easy for us to go on building our movement and building our community and building links with other struggles and all those things that would make and will make survival more certain and easier.
But organizing an opposition from having different pasts and different backgrounds and being in this so-called multicultural city, one thing they wanted to tell us was that racism started, when in Toronto the Good, when the immigrants started coming here at the turn of the 70s, and of course that's not so, because you have the the destruction of the I don't know what to call them, the native people, the Inuit, the Métis, the Dene. That's what they are.
I realized I had to build a case. I had to build an emotional case as well as what I hope would be a rational one. And I think I knew there would be, we all knew there would be some kind of adverse reaction. There had been in the past. Homosexuality was much more in the news by that point, and gays were an organized force in the community, in the general community by that time too, and I guess seemed to be a threatening one, at least by some, aspects of the government or the police. So we knew something would happen. We speculated mostly, I guess, a more intense version of what happened the first time. Louder, shriekier editorials, Claire Hoy going right off the deep end. And I guess all of that did happen. We weren't prepared, clearly, for criminal charges to come. And that was, that surprised me, surprised us all, I think. Didn't shock me anymore, I guess, because, well, I suppose part of me even liked the sense of power that it gave to the words that I had written. I mean, there's even some ego thing built into it. When you wrote something which someone thought powerful enough, I guess, to think that criminal charges were justified. And although I didn't want that to happen, and there were many things about the ensuing court battles that I didn't like and were very draining and exhausting, nonetheless, I felt the article must have shaken some of the right things if it got that kind of reaction.
Well, if I could even tell a little bit too, before I tell you about how it expanded, but why IMICAN in itself was closed down. You see, because, as I mentioned earlier on, the project was funded by the government, and what they wanted to do was set up a factory type thing where people would come in to work at 8. You would put in your 8 hours or how much ever, and then you would lock up and go home in the evening. But that's not what we wanted to do. You see, it was more than just coming and, like I say, factory type of thing. It was a whole new social order that we were trying to create. And I think because we started to, in a sense, we weren't following all the guidelines set down by the government as to how the project should function. We felt it was necessary in order for our own growth to expand into other areas. And I think once we started to do that, and in some ways we're becoming self-sufficient, my personal feeling is that the government felt threatened, that this could have further implications later down the road. So it's best to put a stop to it right here and now before it gets too much further ahead, because, like I said, the Regent Park in particular was really becoming, the youths in the park, the black youths, were really becoming more a positive force. We're becoming more aware of themselves and their presence, you see. And there was a lot of changes that was happening in the area, and it was all because of what was happening.